Hi, I'm Lucy Faye, currently living in denial of my Zoom graduation in a week's time and my isolation 18th birthday a few days later. Today my marketing team and I have decided to change things up a bit. Rather than talking about a movie that came out in 2019 whose critical reviews I disagreed with, I'm gonna do a little two-part series on pandemic movies. The first two being featured in this episode focus on the smaller single city or town and the somewhat realistic government response that ends up fucking over said city or said town. These two movies are The Crazies 2010 and Blindness 2008, directed by Breck Eisner and Fernando Meirelles, respectively. Since I am talking about multiple movies with which I have differing opinions on both quality and effectiveness, I felt the most efficient way to review these movies is through categorizing. The categories are as follows: the nature and establishment of the society that surrounds the plot, the creativity of the disease and pandemic situation, as well as just general goodness. Starting off with The Crazies 2010, a classic story of the government fucking up and then overcompensating by destroying a small town in the middle of America. The society in this movie is rather well defined. It's a small rural town where everyone knows the sheriff personally and people attend Little League baseball games. But because of a mysterious plane crash in the central water source, Big Brother is secretly watching. Society is small but well defined. We understand the basic morals and religious values as well as general geographical area and major industries. As the movie progresses, the town is very much in a state of confusion as infected people commit crazy acts, which I'll go into later. When the government shows up and martial law is put into place, the entire town is turned on its head. No longer is an internal issue for the sheriff to work with the townsfolk to solve. It is instead another government secret dealt with through brute force and hive mentality. The movie continues as our protagonists escape from faceless mobs of soldiers, until the movie concludes with a big twist that, spoilers, the disease has spread and it's time for the government to take control of a much bigger city, before the virus manages to spread to the whole country. Now onto the disease and the overall creativity of the whole pandemic. I like this disease, but we're at a bit of a loss when it comes to the rules. A movie in a horror, thriller, or sci-fi style needs to make a commitment. Is the central force of villainy vague and gets its frightening effect from its mystery? Or is it well defined and relies on look, action, or power to provoke terror in the audience? And there are so many combinations within this. You have absolute mystery, like the zombies from Night of the Living Dead, who aren't even referred to as zombies. We don't know their weaknesses or abilities, and we definitely don't know their backstory. Then you have Leatherface from the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. No backstory or context except weird hick in the middle of nowhere, but we know his abilities. He's a large human with a chainsaw and plenty of other fun weapons. Lastly, you get classic, old-fashioned European vampires. They're vampires because upon dying, they had turned their back on the church or committed witchcraft. And now they're vampires with well-defined vampire powers who spread their vampire-ness in a well-defined vampire way. The infected in this movie have a generally clear backstory. Government-made chemicals make people crazy. But then what happens? One infected person burns down his house with his wife and child inside, one stabs strangers with a pitchfork, and one tries to kill the sheriff out of revenge. So what does said infection do? The crazies kill people. Okay, but why and how? Do they specifically target families? Can they empathize, or are they just mindless killing machines? If so, then why don't they kill faster? Are they intelligent? Can they understand language and threats? Or are they basically semi-conscious zombies that love killing? Can you hold a vendetta after death? We needed way more of an explanation and rule-making. You don't even need dialogue to describe their abilities. Just show a clear motive and weakness through the actions of two infected people. That's all we need. Also, major plot hole / discrepancy alert! Over the course of quite a few days, did no one drink the infected water? I know the dad from Santa Clarita Diet turned off the water source, but there's like 2 days where anyone in that town who doesn't have a well is drinking from and bathing in and just generally interacting with this infected water. And then when they're all taken by the government, it looks like a couple dozen are infected. Are most people just immune upon initial contact? Also, what's the incubation period of this disease? They don't need to tell us, but it'd be nice to have a countdown. Especially because they use the word in the movie, but they use it wrong. That's right, y'all. 2 months into quarantine, and I am a resident disease fucking expert. And I noticed a little bitty discrepancy where Science Lady is all like, the incubation time is 3 days, and then they frickin' die. As if incubation time means time between infection and death, which is heckin' Wrong. Get freaking owned, screenwriters, you dumb fucks. Now, in terms of creativity of the pandemic in this movie, it's fine. All the things are kind of standard. As I mentioned before, government infects town, government takes town hostage, protagonists escape mindless killing machine soldiers. But it's still done well. I'm surprised when the government shows up. I didn't predict the ending. And they put a few smaller details throughout the movie just to make it more fun. Like the hunters who get in trouble at the beginning of the movie for hunting after hunting season ended start poaching people who escape the military confinement. Or when an infected guy gets in the room with anyone who ran a high temperature, whether they're infected or not, and starts stabbing people with a pitchfork, but they can't stop him because they're strapped down to beds. It takes a standard plot and spices it up with gorier and bleaker situations. Finally, a quick overview on the goodness of this movie. So the characters in this movie are pretty basic stereotypes. Level-headed sheriff, slightly impulsive deputy, pregnant wife who's constantly in danger, and dumbass pedestrians. But it's pretty good. Dialogue works, relationships change and seem realistic enough. I also really liked the pacing in the first act of this movie. We get a really slow ease into the action, and tenseness is starting to build up. And then right as chaos is starting to ensue, hard cut to government takeover, and everything goes to shit. From here on out, it's basically a zombie movie, which is in no way a problem. The one aspect of this movie that really frickin' irked me was the Deus Ex Machina. They used it 4 times on the same character. So at a point, it's like, oh, okay, so there's no risk for the sheriff then. Even after the deputy dies and it's just the sheriff and his pregnant wife, you're not on the edge of your seat, they're gonna be fine. So suffice to say, I would call this movie fine. Entertaining, pretty short, non-offensive acting, but I will not say that as the thing that puts this movie above its competitors. This movie has some fantastic, gory, surprising deaths. It's incredible. And they're always out of nowhere, normal movie stuff happening, then bam, bone saw to the face. Or bam, hose hangs one of the main characters. It's awesome. And for a movie that, from a horror perspective, really isn't that scary, the gore really sets it apart. Plus, in case this wasn't clear, I'm in a bit of a gore and body horror phase right now. I don't know. Watch this movie if you like zombie movies, or looking for a less spooky but still entertaining horror movie. Moving on to Blindness 2008, directed by the Brazilian filmmaker behind the critically acclaimed Two Popes. But even if you were above the age of 6 when Blindness was released, you probably don't remember it. It received extremely varying critical reviews that made the movie look like it was mediocre, and it kind of bombed in the American box office. Now this is a dark fucking movie. A disease strikes in a major city causing mass blindness. It caught the government completely off guard, and as hospitals are trying to make quarantined living quarters, the disease spreads like wildfire. The city turns to complete anarchy as those who have not been infected fear losing their sight. So basically what ends up happening is large numbers of the blind are forced into these mal-equipped hospital quarantines, with no supervision and minimal rations. Except, big lucky twist, Mark Ruffalo, my love's wife, Julianne Moore, snuck in very early on to help her blind husband, but she for some reason is immune to the disease and can still see. This large group of blind people are left on their own for basically months, and some fucked up shit happens. All the time. So, overview done, time for my categories. First off, the broadery of society is rather vast here. It's a general large city because the movie wasn't filmed in America but is still meant to take place here, so the most society building we get is the standard unfeeling, individually minded, no one cares about the other man until they're forced to live in close proximity and rely off one another. And a lot of this movie takes place in little quarantined rooms in the hospital, so a sort of Lord of the Flies scenario takes hold. One asshole finds a gun and holds everyone else's food hostage. So there's this secondary societal aspect that's formed throughout the movie that I think was very well defined and realistically established. But it's also, as I said, what causes a lot of the fucked up shit to happen. Next up, onto the disease and general creativity of the pandemic. I would call this movie pretty uninspired in that sense. Very straightforward. You get the disease, you go blind, it's spread through touch. Not much there, but there doesn't need to be. This movie is very much the artsy indie take on a pandemic. So while the plot is straightforward and kind of convenient, why the fuck are hundreds of blind individuals left totally on their own? Like, I understand that civilians are afraid of getting the disease, but you can't just say, fuck it, y'all can figure it out. There would be doctors and nurses and family members in these quarantine rooms around the clock. So since the creativity is rather lacking, I thought we'd move quickly into why this movie is fucking great. and beautiful and very pretentious, but just so fucking good. So this movie does some kinda crazy color stuff. I can't describe it and do it justice, because hell if I know what lighting techniques are called, but the director does this thing where for large portions of the movie, where the one person with sight, Julianne Moore, isn't the followed perspective, our vision of the movie gets overtaken by a bright light. The scenes are kind of hazy and hard to make out as a representation of the blind nature of most of the characters in this movie, who experience a white nothingness as opposed to a dark nothingness. And just very effective alongside some of the very emotionally driven camera work that either gives you the stress of the infected or the guilt of the observer. So, speaking of emotion, this movie made me feel a lot of them. You're on this journey with these characters, and it's a slow build. We're observing primarily one place at one time with one main thing happening. So you go from curiosity as to what's happening and where's this going, to worry when more infected are shoved into the tiny hospital spaces, to anger, to fear, to frustration, and finally to bliss and uncertainty. None of the emotions I felt were surface level. When I was angry, it was justified and passionate. I hated the fascist who took over deeply. And I suppose now's the best time to say that this movie is super not for everyone. One of the things that I think discouraged, rightfully so, a lot of audiences from watching this movie was the rape scene. This ain't your typical Death Wish class of 1984 medium shot thrusting with nudity and overdone screaming rape scene. This is a close-up, minimal music, brutal, long scene, and it's a lot for anyone to experience. It's not something you can just shake off, you remember it. The reason this didn't necessarily turn me off the movie is because of how important that scene is. It sets your environment and makes it okay and satisfying when one of the women kills the fascist who took over while another burns the entire compound down. Plus, it makes the last couple sequences when they escape the hospital so much more worth it. To see our protagonists outside and free and not safe, but away from the toxicity, fills you with an elation. But that's why with my recommendation, which is very positive and a little vague, because as I said, I don't think a lot of people have seen this movie, I also speak with trepidation. Know your limits, both over the fact that this is a slow-moving, artistic, bleak film, as well as over the multiple scenes that are really shocking and extreme. It is a fantastic film that does so much with such a simplistic plot that I believe deserves a lot more praise than it's got because, not to sound pretentious or anything, but I have to agree with the director on this one. I doubt this movie would have done nearly as bad if it were released in Portuguese geared towards a South American audience. Americans have come to expect a retribution for a character wronged, and we can turn against the more dark humanity that leaves dissatisfaction. As I said at the beginning of this video, this is part 1 of a 2-part pandemic series. The next part should come out Friday of next week, so long as I keep on top of my shit. I am graduating after all. Expect the next video on World War Z 2013 and The Happening 2008 by June 5th. Cool. Bye.